Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Bingert. I am the Executive Director of the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association, and I am very eager to bring this session to you today to help hopefully navigate what has become a very difficult circumstance in our schools. As we know, a panic about critical race theory has taken on a life of its own, developing a connection to educational programming in K-12 schools that was frankly never intended for what is otherwise an academic model for evaluating the impact decisions may have on different races. We have seen this CRT conflated with the other CRT, culturally responsive teaching. We have also experienced an increasingly volatile, verbal, and potentially violent portion of our communities who fear that schools are somehow going to teach important concepts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion to support some of our students to the detriment of others. It is not easy to be on the front lines of this situation right now, which is yet another topic hitting critical mass at a time when our communities, our nation, and our world are already torn apart and worn down in so many ways. Our goal today is to confront the misconceptions of critical race theory head on, as well as to clarify the definitions of what schools actually are doing in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Always looking to be practical and give you takeaways that you can apply, we hope to give talking points and a deeper understanding of these issues to help you de-escalate the arguments that are coming from places of fear and anger to move to doing what schools do best, which is to serve as a town center for their communities, making connections and building bridges. I am very excited to introduce you to the rest of our panel today. I'm also going to remind everybody as you're logging in, please make sure we'd love to have cameras on because it's great to see people and make eye contact as we're communicating. But we will remind you, please keep microphones off until there's an opportunity to speak. So we hear the rest of our presenters today. As I said, I'm Karen Bingert, the Executive Director of NJPSA. I'm also a career educator, and I left my position as principal just at the end of June, having served 22 years as a building administrator and 29 years total in education. Also with us today is Donna McInerney, the CEO of the Foundation of Educational Administration, David Nash, who is the Director of Legal Education and National Outreach for FEA, Fidelia Sturdivant, who is the Coordinator of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for NJPSA and FEA, Robin Harden Daniels, who is a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Change Practitioner. And a change practitioner title is, I think something we all want at some point or another. And Patricia Haney, Superintendent of Logan Township School District. I'm thrilled to welcome all of them to join us today and to engage in some great conversation about this important issue. And without further ado, I'm happy to turn this program over to David Nash.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you everyone for taking time out of what I know are incredibly demanding schedules as we all work to continue the safe implementation of a new school year. We know that you're dealing with so many issues all at once. And of course, we want to help you as you're addressing issues related to our new instructional requirements and to help you have the tools to communicate with all of your key stakeholders. As we talk today, of course, we're going to be addressing a number of important legal issues. As we do that, for those of you who have been involved in Legal One sessions before, you know this, we're giving you the latest legal information. Of course, we're not giving legal advice on any particular matter that you might be dealing with in your district. We will encourage you as we go throughout the day to type in the chat if you have particular questions. And we'll absolutely do our best to address all of the issues along the way and to follow up for those that we're not able to address today. So our game plan for today is to begin with a review of some current legal requirements to make sure you understand where we are with instructional requirements and some other important requirements related to addressing issues of race, issues of discrimination in our schools. to then review with you some key terms and concepts so that we're all working from a common base when it comes to our language, to give you some potential scenarios to think through, and to think about how we would address these issues, some lessons we can take from these scenarios, some important protocols that we should be putting in place as we're dealing with critical issues related to race and discrimination in our curriculum. Of course, we'll encourage you at various points in time to type in questions that you might have, and we will give you some useful resources to help you with next steps as we're looking to put in place the kind of curriculum that all of our students deserve. It's an important starting point, I think, for us to make sure that we're on the same page and understand the instructional requirements that we do have in place in New Jersey. So we do have Chapter 32 that was enacted and is really an important base for all of us when it comes to our K through 12 instruction. So this new statutory requirement requires us to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion K through 12. Of course, we have been doing much of this work for many years in New Jersey. There's incredible work happening in all of our schools. We have related curriculum requirements that address portions of what we have in this particular statute that many of you have been doing for lots of years. But let's look at, in particular, some of the new requirements that we are implementing as of this school year. So every school district has to have in place a K through 12 curriculum that highlights and promotes diversity, addresses issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, tolerance, and belonging in connection with a number of areas: gender and sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, disabilities, religious tolerance. We have to examine the impact of unconscious bias and economic disparities, not only at the individual level, not only looking at discrete acts of discrimination that might occur, but also looking at the larger systemic issues in our society. And the legislature very consciously made that decision for us to look at both the individual issues and the institutional and societal issues that we need to address and overcome. And the legislation very specifically says K through 12, we're going to be promoting a safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment for all students, regardless of race or ethnicity, sexual or gender identity, mental and physical disability, and religious belief. So we are addressing important, complex issues in age-appropriate ways, K through 12. And it's important that we recognize that. Of course, today we're very focused on the aspects of this law that deal with addressing racial discrimination and related issues on race. The statute itself is much broader and also addresses these other areas like gender identity. So I do want to stress the broader nature of Chapter 32. We have other important curriculum requirements that it's important to make sure that we do recognize that are in place. So for example, in 2019, the legislature did put in place a requirement for us to teach about political, economic, and social contributions of individuals with disabilities and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons. So that curriculum was enacted in 2019. We implemented that starting this past school year in the middle of the pandemic, of course, with all of those challenges. And we know there has been some pushback on that issue. We do anticipate that and know that there has been some pushback on the new Chapter 32 requirements as well. So on the Chapter 6 requirements from 2019, for example, we saw a school board member post this comment to a superintendent, believing that it was disgusting and appalling that we would put in place this new requirement. That particular comment, an email from a board member to a superintendent, had to be made public when there was an Open Public Records Act request. So one of the things that we want to be very aware of is that any electronic communications involving school board members or school district employees that address issues like curriculum requirements are susceptible to a request under the Open Public Records Act for the world to see. And of course, when we make these sorts of comments, there can be significant, very serious repercussions. We know that there are other curriculum requirements that address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We give you a list of a number of those requirements here. One of the things I want to stress, and we will stress this throughout today's webinar, there is no opting out of the requirements under Chapter 32 that we're reviewing today when it comes to addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion K through 12. The legislature made a conscious decision that this new curriculum requirement was not limited to the health curriculum. It's a broader requirement that must be addressed K through 12 without any option for individual students to be excused from particular portions of that curriculum. So as we address these legal requirements, of course, there are other issues that could come into play. New Jersey has a requirement for districts to have a comprehensive equity plan that addresses all aspects of school district operations. And we will talk about the importance, for example, of having a strong commitment on our hiring practices to have a greater diversity in our school staff. If we are implementing these new requirements related to the curriculum, we may learn about issues that invoke the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights or the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination. When we're thinking about implementing this curriculum, we have to make sure that we're also in an inclusive way dealing with our gifted and talented students and making sure that we're providing opportunities that are not limited in any way for students based on race, ethnicity, or other factors. We have to be aware of the broader civil rights issues that could come up under state or federal law. We need to be aware of the New Jersey School Ethics Act. Of course, school board members have a critical role to play in approving curriculum for individual school districts. And it's important for board members to understand that larger policy-making role and not to be drawn into, for example, discussions at public board meetings regarding individual staff members, and to make sure that those are appropriately addressed through the proper channels and through the superintendent and appropriate supervisors within the district. It's important as we think about implementing this new curriculum requirement that we make sure that we're honoring and protecting the rights of all staff members. So staff members should not be subject to any sort of public discussion at a board meeting without first having notice of that and the opportunity for that discussion to take place in closed session. If individual staff members had to be addressed because of how they were implementing any particular requirement, including our curriculum requirements, certain Weingarten rights would kick in to make sure that person was properly protected. We have strong tenure and seniority laws. All this is to say is that as employees are implementing what can be controversial issues, but are state required curriculum requirements, we need to make sure that we're honoring the rights and due process protections for all of those staff members. It's also important to recognize that when school employees are engaged in good faith in implementing new requirements, that they are protected, that we have very strong indemnification provisions in New Jersey law to protect individuals when they're acting in good faith, implementing state requirements. So certainly as we're implementing our new curriculum requirements, there are some complex issues that come up. And employees should rest assured that they do have strong protection from their school district and very strong protection under state law. We do know that, of course, that students and staff members have First Amendment rights that need to be protected, and there are different parameters for those rights that we need to understand. And we'll walk through that as well. And while it's not our focus today, remember again, Chapter 32 also addresses issues of gender identity. We will be separately addressing that in more detail in a future webinar. So when it comes to Chapter 32, there are some potential legal issues that could arise as we're trying to implement this important new curriculum requirement. For example, students may attempt to discuss current events that are very sensitive in nature related to race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and could do so in a way that might be hurtful to others without intending to do that. So it's important that we equip teachers to set the ground rules for these important conversations, to make sure everyone understands how to move forward and have these discussions in an appropriate, respectful way. We may have parents who attempt to object to some portions of this particular instructional requirement, might ask to have their child opt out. It's important to engage with those parents, get them to understand what the requirements are. But again, it is also important to stress that there is no provision here for opting out of this essential required curriculum. We might have individual staff members who perhaps raise an issue about implementing some portion of the curriculum. If you are a teacher who's charged with implementing a curriculum that is essential to your role as a teacher, and you do need to actually follow through and implement that full curriculum. We could have ill-conceived teacher assignments, teachers acting in good faith, well-intentioned. So it's important that we take the time to review lesson plans regarding these complex, difficult issues to make sure that they are well thought out. We need to be prepared. Students might raise difficult personal experiences that they've had as we're talking about issues related to race and discrimination and other protected characteristics. And staff need to be ready for that. And there could be objections that come from board members, from other political leaders regarding this new requirement. Again, it's important to understand that what we're implementing is a state required curriculum, and it is critical that we address these difficult issues. So when we're talking about implementing these requirements, we have to make sure we understand the First Amendment rights of students and staff members. Students do have a right to express their views, even if other students might disagree with them, within certain parameters. We cannot have student speech that is resulting in substantial disruption to the school environment. We cannot have speech that amounts to hate speech that is targeting individuals, for example, because of their race or ethnicity or gender or disability. We have to make sure the speech in question is not threatening or lewd or vulgar or promoting any sort of illegal activity. So there are certain parameters for student speech, and we have to be prepared to address those in the curriculum while we're having these important discussions. For staff members, there are a different set of parameters. So we certainly want to make sure that staff members understand that when you are implementing a curriculum, this is not the time or place for you to try to impose your political ideology, your religious views. It's a time for you to implement the state required curriculum. And we do have some important case law along those lines. So for example, we had a case in the state of New Jersey where a teacher tried to argue that she had a First Amendment right to address the curriculum in the way that she chose, even if it didn't necessarily align with state requirements. And our courts made very clear that there was no such First Amendment right. When you are teaching in a classroom, you have a curriculum that's been approved by the district that's consistent with state law. That's what you're expected to implement. We also have some other case law that provides cautionary tales for staff members that have sometimes gone too far in their expressions, and there have been very serious repercussions. So we had a case, the Zaplinski case, where we had a security guard who expressed really hurtful comments that were racially charged after a police officer had been shot, and made comments that were linked to race and suggesting that there was some racially charged component to those police shootings. The language that was used, the word thug was used, linked to race. The school district ended up terminating that particular security guard, and federal courts upheld that decision because the speech used was really a form of hate speech, and that was not within First Amendment rights. We've had other lessons. We had a case involving a first grade teacher who came home from school one day and said, "I feel like I'm a warden to future criminals." That first grade teacher was also terminated. That happened to be a class that had a large number of Black students. And that comment was reasonably perceived as a racially charged comment and just generally an inappropriate comment. And there were tenure charges brought against that teacher that were successful. We do know that sometimes we have students who are targeted and are subject to inappropriate comments. We know that there has been a rise in anti-Asian sentiment and incidents across the country. We had a case a number of years ago in New Jersey where an Asian student was targeted. That particular student happened to be very resilient, and even though there was an inappropriate comment made to the students, it was not found to be harassment, intimidation, or bullying. And the lesson from that case is that we have some incredibly resilient students. You might have inappropriate behavior that still has to be addressed under your code of conduct. It might not rise to that level of bullying. And we have case law that tells us that it's critical that we review lesson plans. We had a case a number of years ago where there was a teacher who had a lesson that was called the Can of Squirms lesson, where students were asked to talk about their most embarrassing moment and to do so in front of the entire class, a really inappropriate lesson. Unfortunately, that lesson had been very clearly laid out in the lesson plan, and that lesson plan had been approved by the school administration. So the district was not able to move forward with tenure charges against the individual because of that approved lesson plan. So it's really important as we're implementing these difficult issues to make sure we take the time to review those lesson plans to make sure they are appropriate. And bottom line is we have a legal duty of care. It's a broad duty of care that goes to the heart of what we do. We have a legal duty of care to promote a school environment conducive to learning for all of our students, to protect students from foreseeable harms, including those that could arise from both acts of intentional and unintentional discrimination, to ensure staff are properly trained to understand and implement the new requirements that we're talking about, to engage in progressive supervision if we need to. If there are any breakdowns in how we're implementing our curriculum, how we're protecting and supporting our students, to make sure that we address those, to make sure that all key stakeholders have the information they need to respond if some of these foreseeable challenges do come up as we're trying to implement a complex new curriculum, K through 12. And of course, we have a legal duty to make sure that we do protect the due process rights of all staff members who are working very hard, acting in good faith, trying to put these new requirements into place. So with that brief overview, we can pause for a moment if we have any questions from our listeners, and then I'll be happy to turn it over to Fidelia Sturdivant.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin with a quote from Anita, Dr. Anita Hill. "We can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge." And I related that to inequity. But I also thought about it, we can fix what we acknowledge. And I think about that in terms of equity. Next, please. Critical race theory is an academic concept and a way of understanding how American racism has shaped public policy and law. Basically, it's the principle of people, Black, white, and all, to recognize that racism is a social construct, critically examining law and policy, addressing bias and other forms of marginalization. That's the basic principle. CRT does not accuse one individual of bias or prejudice. It's normally looking at a group perception. CRT says that racism is a part of everyday life, so people, white or non-white, make choices that sort of aggravate and influence racism. CRT analyzed disparities in law enforcement, health, wealth, housing, and education. If you look at the icon of the scale, you can see that it's not balanced. So we're dealing here with fairness and justice. CRT is not the same as culturally responsive pedagogy. Very different. Culturally responsive pedagogy affirms students' ethnic and racial backgrounds through the integration of academic content, curricula, and representation. It's looking holistically at everyone in that classroom, looking at everyone in our society. CRT has been politicized, targeted, labeled as anti-American and diverse and diverse, but forget it, and
Divisive,
diverse, okay?
yeah. Mhm.
All right, but it's not those things. The critical race theory does not promote propaganda, hatred of America, or a leftist ideology that threatens the American way of life. To sum it up, there is no need to be fearful. Now, let's look at these umbrellas, okay? And look at the terms on the umbrellas. Every label on the umbrellas relate to our professional responsibility as educational leaders. There are definitions, there are working definitions. However, please feel free to enter a definition that you would like to share in the chat. Implicit unconscious bias, an unconsciously held set of associations about a social group. It's possible to unconsciously associate a positive or negative trait to a person's identity marker. Explicit is conscious bias. The individual is aware of their prejudice and biases and their attitudes towards a certain group of people. Implicit or explicit bias hurt the same way, okay? It's not any less whether it's implicit. Racism, a system of oppression that emerges from the beliefs that one race is superior to another based on biological characteristics. Institutionalized racism, racism perpetuated by the social and political institutions such as schools, courts, and the military. And we can also refer to that as systemic racism. Next, diversity. The practice of including and recognizing people of different groups, different social economic backgrounds, its cultural background, and it includes everyone, all genders. No one should be excluded. We're talking about diversity. That's what America is about. Justice. When I think of justice, I think of law. And that means that people behave in a way that is fair, equitable, and it's a balance for everyone, not just some people, but everyone. Fear. Fear alerts us of the presence of danger or of threat of harm, whether the danger is physical or psychological. Fear is our human emotion. We have them, but keep in mind, it could be physical or psychological. Culturally responsive teaching, a pedagogy that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. And keep in mind, it should be present in the classroom. When you walk into that classroom, you should see some diversity. Critical race theory, we talked about it, an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of an individual bias or prejudice, but also something that is embedded in the legal systems and policies. Equality versus equity. Now, we've seen this chart many, many times, but if you just look at the first, you see that there is the same support, but it's not helping everyone. If we look at the second image, we see that the support is better and that everyone can see over the fence. So we're talking about equity. But let's look at justice, which is unique in as much as that the systemic barrier has been removed. So we don't have to worry about it being ample support, same support. There is no barrier, which makes it fair. There is the justice that we're talking about. Next. Next, Dave. Equality, okay? Let's just for a moment. Equality is about sameness. It focuses on making sure that everyone gets the same thing, equality. But let's look at equity. Equity is about fairness. It ensures that each person gets what that person needs. And that's the difference. I'm ready, Dave. School equity. This touches my heart as a retired principal, but more so as an educator and a teacher. Every child gets what he needs in our schools, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, who their parents are, and their temperament. Doesn't matter. What they show up in school knowing or not knowing. Every child gets what he, she, or they need every day in order to have all the skills and tools to pursue what they want after leaving our schools to have a fulfilling life. They're entitled to that. Equity is about outcomes and experiences for every child, every day. That's what equity is about. Now, I've gone over a lot of terms, and here again, I hope that you felt free to share your definitions in the chat. Donna, do we have any additional definitions that we should share?
None that I could come to my mind, Fidelia, but I do have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first question is pretty much a legal one, Dave, so I'm going to throw it your way.
Sure.
Are emails from individuals running for the Board of Ed, but not currently elected, ever subject to Oprah?
So they are not yet school officials. So you don't have the same requirements under Oprah. They could still be discoverable in litigation, but they would not be discoverable under the Open Public Records Act.
Thank you. Another question that came up has to deal more with, let me just scroll back up real quick.
I would say to one point on this that if a person received such an email and responded, that could be discoverable under Oprah. So keep that in mind. If you're a school employee responding to that candidate, now you might have something that is under Oprah.
Next question, can a parent opt out if the diversity and inclusion standards are addressed in health classes?
A parent cannot opt out because the legislature made clear this was not intended as a health-only curriculum. So if the legislature had intended for an opt-out, they would have allowed that. Districts can choose to just implement it there, but they can't choose to allow an opt-out. That wasn't permitted.
Okay. Yep, that's what I thought. I think there's one more. Let me see if I can find it real quick. If there's an overlap for family education versus family types in social studies, how do we address this with parents? We may have some other members of our team who want to jump in on that one.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. The question is, if there is an overlap for family education versus family types in social studies, how do we address this with parents? And Shauna, you posed the question, so you may want to unmute and provide some clarity for the team.
Sure. So for instance, if in a social studies unit in the primary grades on all kinds of families, that we're showing a family with 2 moms or 2 dads. And on the flip side of that, you know, we have parents who quote unquote morally object to their children seeing a family in that light. You know, they're making the case that that's family life education and doesn't really have a place in social studies. So I'm wondering, you know, where do we draw that line? You know, showing, you know, a family with 2 dads. Yes, it could be family life, but we make the case that it could also belong in social studies, and we're getting some pushback on that.
I would say as a legal matter, it sounds like it's something that falls under both categories potentially, but it definitely falls under Chapter 32 and the areas that are covered outside of just the family life curriculum.
Mhm.
I'd like Rob would also jump in on that too to respond.
In terms of the question, I was thinking of when you're doing in social studies, any kind of conversation in pertaining to culture and how cultures change and adapt. You know, basically in every culture, there is a concept of family. It may not be the same in every culture, but every culture has it. And we also kind of universally agree that family is the basic building block of any culture, any society. And so to me, it brings it up as fair game within the context of a social studies conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin and Daniel. So there's an observation here that the definition for CRT is the academic definition, but it's not the definition used by the community. And I think this is one of the challenges. Fidelia, do you want to respond to that? Or we can have one of the other members of our team.
Sure, I would.
We can
Robin?
all jump in. I totally agree. It is not the definition that in some cases are shared by the community, but I think knowledge is power. And we have to keep in mind what the true definition is. Because someone else says that it's not an academic concept, doesn't mean that that comment that they made is true. So here again, yes, you're going to get that. That's the pushback. That's the intent. That's targeting and falsely labeling CRT. But please, someone else, please feel free to jump in.
Sure.
I'm happy to.
Who would like to go first?
All I was going to say, Robin, was, I think we're all frustrated that there are two CRTs in this world right now. Culturally responsive teaching comes from such a pure and genuine place of working with students, staffs, and communities to build relationships and to recognize everyone for who he, she, or they may be, under all of the categories that they might fit. But the fact that critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching are being just combined into this one concept of CRT is really doing a disservice to our students and our schools, and it's putting educators in a really precarious position of trying to defend the important work that we're doing while not getting mired down in this academic construct that's out there as a way of looking at society. They're not the same thing, and that's why we wanted to hold this webinar today to clarify some definitions and to give some talking points, as you'll see when we go on just a little bit further, for ways to respond when people try to combine the two or to kind of muddy the waters with what schools are actually doing.
And it can be useful because the definitions have been so muddied to go back to actually what the statute in New Jersey says. It does say very specifically that we need to address both those issues that impact individuals and individual implicit biases and systemic institutional issues. So even without getting caught up in the phrase critical race theory, going back to the anchor of what we're actually doing in the curriculum, I think is very important.
I think part of the challenge in dealing with this is the fact that there are differences in opinion, and those differences in opinion are desired. For those who see critical race theory as a threat, who assume that that's what's happening in the classrooms, there's a commitment to that perspective. And so that's what makes it difficult. And that commitment is coming out of a couple of places. One is out of fear, because there is such a thing as fear of equity. When you have people who have been very successful, they've benefited by the systemic inequities that we see. They've benefited by it, they've profited from it. And I don't want a level playing field. I want to maintain my privilege. I want to maintain my advantage. And so there's kind of a visceral response to this, like, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to level the playing field. Another dynamic that's associated with that, and all of these things are related. Another dynamic is associated with the differences between individual racism and systemic racism. When you're listening to conversations about inequity, you can hear that, whether if we're looking at police brutality or police actions, well, that's just one bad apple. That's just one person who did this one thing. That's the individual perspective of racism. But when we start talking about it systemically, when we start talking about it globally, then the person who sees it from an individual lens is going to immediately be threatened by that conversation. It's not systemic. It's just one bad apple. No, it's a global problem. And so you're going to see, these kinds of conversations happen and this kind of pushback. because fundamentally it's going against the concept of privilege, that some people have had it and some have not. And those who have it don't want to lose it. They don't want to lose it at the ballot. They don't want to lose it in the classroom. They don't want to lose it in curriculum. And so what you're facing is some very severe interpretations of people's survival. You know, I am fighting this because I see you, I see what you're doing. I see Chapter 32 as an existential threat to my children's well-being. And that's why you have the intensity and the veracity of what we're seeing right now.
Thanks, Robin. We have a couple other requests, and then we're going to move on to the scenarios. There was one request for a well-informed script for educators to use for parents who want to opt their kids out. You'll see later on in the PowerPoint, we've provided some great talking points. We'll add a piece to that before we send it out for the opt-out response. There's some talking here about the resources. And let me just, there's one other one I just want to pull up before we move on to the scenarios.
And Donna, as you're looking for that, I want to add that, you know, one of the reasons that we were reviewing the vocabulary and included the words that we did, it's part of what is so important is that we are all working from the same understanding of this terminology, and that we are consistently using this language as we communicate with our communities, as we communicate with our staff members and our students, so that there is a common understanding of what schools are trying to accomplish with culturally responsive teaching with Chapter 32. And the reason we included the word fear goes back to exactly what Robin was saying about the fear of seeing what you understand of the world challenged in some way. And is that what is really happening right now? And that requires that we sit down and look at our own internal systems to see what efforts we're making and how we are focusing on the needs of all of our students. And then that ties into equal, equitable, and just. So it's quite an interconnected web of considerations that with which we have to work.
Yeah, I agree. Focusing on that learning, a shared message, a common understanding, clear communication are all part of it. Last couple of questions before we move on to the scenarios is the two are both related. And Dave, I'm going to toss these your way. Is New Jersey teaching CRT curriculum? Because that's often put out there. And is a core curriculum standard already set up for Chapter 32?
So New Jersey is not specifically teaching critical race theory under our curriculum requirements. What we are teaching is that we have to address both the individual issues related to racism and discrimination and the institutional and larger societal issues related to racism and discrimination, and those other broad areas of protected classes as well. So the phrase critical race theory doesn't exist, but those essential concepts that we talked about have to be addressed at both levels. And the second question again, Donna?
Is there a core curriculum standard tied in with Chapter 32?
So we have existing core standards that address many of these issues. I imagine the State Board of Education will be adding to those moving forward because this is a new requirement. But you can see in our existing curriculum requirements, a number of these areas already being addressed. But the State Board will review this to see if there might be some revisions that have to be made or additions.
All right, thanks, David. Let's take a look at some of the scenarios. Here at NJPSA and FEA, we speak with members every day and we hear the stories. We learn the challenges that you are facing. And I will tell you that recently one of our members, and he's a principal at Matawan Regional High School in Aberdeen, and he's on the NJPSA board. He was recently quoted earlier this month in an article in Ed Week. And while he was talking about parent frustration around the pandemic-related issues, mask mandates, quarantine policies, I think it really illustrates what many of our leaders are facing. And what Aaron said was, I would rather them yell at me than yell at my administrative team, yell at the teachers, yell at the nurse, yell at the main office people. And I think it illustrates and crystallizes exactly what the level of emotion is out there and what a lonely role many of our leaders are forced to play. And so our job at NJPS and PSA and FEA is to support you through webinars, through roundtables, through professional learning. So together, our team put together a series of scenarios, and I'm going to ask our team to respond. We've got represented on our team, Karen, who is a former high school principal, Fidelia, who's a former elementary principal, Pat Haney, who's a current superintendent, Robin Daniels, former central office administrator and current change activist with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, if you'll be patient with me, we've got a number of people on this webinar who are audio only and not visual. So I'm going to read the scenario while you take a look at it on the screen. So in the first scenario, Ms. Thomas, the high school AP history teacher, is reviewing a lesson related to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. A student, Latanya, asks Ms. Thomas, how do we still have so many problems with systemic racism, even after the enactment of landmark civil rights legislation? Ms. Thomas responds by saying, that's a very good question. In fact, I would like the class to study this question and look at why discrimination is still prevalent today in many government institutions, including our educational system and our courts. Students then are provided with a list of suggested resources to assist in their research and given a week. The next morning, Mr. Barker, the father of AP student Donald, comes to the school and confronts the AP history teacher, Ms. Thomas, as she is walking in the building, asking her why she is teaching that BS critical race theory, and promises, I will get you fired over this. Mr. Barker then sees the principal and demands to know what the principal is going to do about Ms. Thomas. So the fundamental question, what should the principal do? So as a former high school principal, Karen, I'm going to invite you as the first one on the panel to give us a response.
Sure thing, Donna. So, this situation happens. Scenarios like this that, there's a learning moment that arises in class and presents a teacher with an opportunity to expand upon the work that students are doing. In this situation, we have to remember that there's a curriculum driving this course, and the content that is being covered in that class is hopefully a part of that curriculum. And if it is, that teacher remains on really solid ground in letting this question go in this direction and providing the students with the extra challenge to do this work. Materials are also a part of the curriculum, and very often most of the materials are approved in advance as part of the curriculum. But let's be realistic. Teachers run across things. Donna ran across the quote from Aaron Eiler and decided to include it in this presentation. Teachers find ancillary materials that they bring into the classroom all the time that may not be part of the approved curriculum, because what we teach is bigger than just that single guiding document. But it is very important for the teacher to be cognizant of the legitimacy of the resources that are being put out there, and from whence it cometh, to make sure that the source material is valid and appropriate for schools. There could potentially be a question related to the phrase, why discrimination is still prevalent in today's many government institutions, including our educational systems and our courts. But to that, I think the response is the very appropriate one of, we have more than enough factual information out there to support that students of color are historically not performing as well as white and sometimes Asian students are in our schools. There are facts out there that demonstrate that there has been a cultural or racial divide in academic performance, in earning a living wage. So some of this information ties back to knowing your facts and having that information at the ready to be able to provide the rationale for why a teacher has gone in a certain direction, and for the teacher to know what is a possible reason for why something would be worth further discussion in class. I'm going to go back to what I said before. We need to discuss the definitions. It is so critical that we are all on the same page, okay? We have to use the same language all the time so that there is no room for misunderstanding. If we are blending words and muddying the waters because we change how we describe something each and every time we do it, then our teachers aren't going to understand what's expected. Our community is not going to understand what's going on. Our students won't understand how we're communicating with them in the building as we're trying to build a successful and positive, proactive and inclusive school environment and develop a great school climate. So that language is really important. And then I just have to say, you know, building bridges is the most important thing we can do. And the best thing that we can always do is to sit down and have the conversation. And they're not easy conversations. We know that. No one wants to be confronted by a parent as you're walking into the building from your car. That's not going to feel like it's a very productive or easy conversation to have. But take control of the situation by saying, I understand you have questions, and we're going to set up a time and we're going to sit down and we're going to answer those questions. And I think you're going to see that what you're afraid of is not what's happening. And to the contrary, we're building a climate that's going to work really well for your child and for the other children in that classroom, as well as the impact that they eventually will have on the world beyond us as they move on into the rest of society.
Thanks, Karen. Fidelia, from the elementary level perspective, is there anything that you want to add?
Certainly I would. First of all, I want to agree with Sally. She made the comment that I would like that teacher to teach my child. So Sally, I'm in agreement with that. And I like the fact that the student asked the question, because it goes back to the quote by Dr. Anita Hill. We can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge. Why does this systemic racism problem continue? That's an excellent question. And I'm glad this is an AP class, but I'm happy that the teacher decided that it was something that was worth going into a deeper dive. Okay, she didn't give an answer. She said, let's research. It gives the students an opportunity to grow. We can't ignore what exists. As Karen said, this is upon us and we see it, but we can't ignore it. And we have to give those students an opportunity to learn and to grow from it. Okay, a parent came in, and notice I said a parent came in. It wasn't a group of parents. That sent the message to me as well. So many times we cannot please everyone, but we can establish a relationship with our parents to say, as Karen mentioned, come, let's talk about this. Let's look at why you're here. Okay, let's look at the curriculum. You know, the teacher did not create the curriculum. This is a state curriculum. It's part of the learning process. And yes, the parent has a right to question, although I don't like the way that the parent spoke to the teacher, okay? But a parent has a right to question, but there's also an opportunity for discussion and to make things right. I think the teacher dealt with it in an excellent way. I think the child was right to ask the question, but here again, we have to acknowledge the problems so that we can fix it. Thank you.
Thanks, Fidelia. So this scenario really appears to be about the principal and the teacher, but we know that there's a broader scope. So I'd like to invite Pat Haney to respond to this from the superintendent's perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And from a lifetime educator's perspective also, because I have been a teacher and a principal also. So obviously I'm just not speaking from a superintendent's point of view. First of all, I support what Karen just said, that the curriculum should be driving the course. But the questions that come about in a course like this are so appropriate. And so I think this was very appropriate for an AP history class, or for any middle school or high school history class, to have a teacher, as Fidelia said, respond to a question, in this case, which was posed by a student engaged in academic discovery, academic research, to lead, and then she led the students to investigate why discrimination is still prevalent in our educational and government systems. I support the teacher in recognizing that and making that statement. There is institutional racism in our education and government system. And then she hands it over to the students with appropriate resources to discover and to use and to research that area. So I believe it's very appropriate for most educational environments, the way it was set up and the way the teacher handled. I think from talking about the parent's response, a parent does, and the parent said, what did the parent said, I will get you fired over this. And that's a threat, but it's an empty threat. A parent, we all know this as administrators, parent doesn't have the power to get a teacher fired. And we have to be strong in not getting nervous or worried or upset when a parent responds that way. Only a superintendent can recommend a teacher to be disciplined for some wrongdoing, and there was nothing wrong done in this case. It was extremely appropriate. I also agreed with what Karen said about building bridges. This is a great opportunity for the principal to invite the parent to have a respectful conversation, and I use the word respectful. Even though the parent wasn't respectful, we have to rise up and above. Remember what Michelle Obama said, when they aim low, we aim high. So the principal should point out that the board supports the teaching of these concepts. And I believe that the principal should reference and say that it's mandated in public law, 2021, chapter 32. Use that for our benefit because it is in the law. And then the important piece here from a superintendent's point of view is the principal should then inform the superintendent. So she is aware, and notice I say she is aware of this interaction since the board was referenced in this conversation. I'm going to get you fired, right? So therefore, and we know it could go even further. So the key piece at the end is making, and you're going to see that in the next scenario of getting the superintendent involved so she is in the loop.
So keeping those channels of communication clear and strong across the district and within buildings, absolutely. Robin, as a change practitioner with a strong background in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, can you share some insights?
Sure. Yes to everything that has been previously said. Yes, the teacher is on point, assuming that this is consistent with curriculum and board approved materials for class. She seems to be in charge of the topic and the materials, and so yes to everything that has been said. In terms of DE&I, DE&I is very different than any other change initiative. It's not the same as, say, moving from Power School to Genesis. It grates upon religious sensibilities, it can grate upon personal sensibilities, political sensibilities, and so it's a different kind of change initiative. And so that's one of the key things that we have to be mindful of. And because of that, because it can grate upon core areas of our identity, our religious, our personal, our political, then what happens is we can get what we see here in terms of Mr. Barker. We talk about flight, fight, or freeze. He's clearly coming in with the fight. And so in any kind of conversation like that, we know that we always, as Pat just said, take the high road because this person is already coming in triggered. We can't have a triggered response on the part of teachers or administrators. That's like pouring kerosene on the campfire. It's not going to work. And so the burden of being in charge of the circumstance, of being composed, really lies upon us. We don't have the opportunity, we don't have the privilege of letting it rip. And in change management, there's an expression: if it feels good in the moment to say it, don't. Don't. It becomes something that you can regret later because we're acting out of being triggered. So from a change management perspective, I am sitting here thinking, okay, I'm wondering what this district's communication plan was. Because when we're looking at bringing in a new innovation, an innovation is anything new. It could be a small innovation like, going from filling out something on paper to filling it out on the computer. It could be a small innovation or a major one. And we know DE&I is major because you're trying to impact people's perspectives, their behavior, in order for them to demonstrate a different set of skills that's non-biased, that's affirming for all students. And so I'm wondering, what was the communication plan to help parents be able to discern the differences between the street definition of CRT versus what we're doing in the classroom with culturally responsive teaching. You know, I'm wondering where's the parsing out of that. But when the principal's dealing with this person, if we're looking at resistance management, this is the number one proactive response to resistance management. And it is simply sitting down with the person one-on-one. It's what Karen and Pat have been talking about. Building bridges, remaining untriggered ourselves, and building bridges. That is the number one strategy for resistance management. Just sitting down, reasoning together. This person is already coming in, already triggered, already ready to fight. So that right there says, okay, I have to do a lot of listening, and I have to do something, say something that can help address this person's fear, because this person is on fire with their fear. And that fear is being expressed through anger and aggression. So if we can sit and listen long enough to ascertain what's really bothering this person, then we have the best possible chance of calming this person down, addressing their fears, and quite possibly, once in every blue moon, getting them to say, wow, gee whiz, I really acted like a jerk, huh? But
Thanks,
that's the
Robin.
strategy. Mhm.
Thank you. Clearly, these cases are grounded in high emotions. And so how we communicate and how we build those bridges is critical. David, can you take us to the next scenario?
Donna,
Yes,
it's Paul. May I make a comment, please?
sure.
Yeah, I'd like to underline what Robin said with regard to understanding your own reaction to things, which requires a great deal of self-awareness, which is a whole other issue around all this. And finally, the principal has to get back to Ms. Thomas to support her and let her know that he or she has her back.
Absolutely. I think that line of communication, central office, building leadership, teacher level, critical that this be a team-based approach where there's tremendous transparency across the school personnel. Definitely. Good points. So let's take us to scenario 2. 2 days later, Mr. Barker shows up at a school board meeting along with 10 other parents. He claims to have a petition signed by more than 100 parents demanding that the district cease and desist teaching critical race theory and providing the option for parents to opt out of any assignment that they find morally offensive. The petition references the principal and the AP history teacher by name and demands that both be disciplined immediately. The petition notes that the principal's doctoral dissertation, written 5 years earlier and found online, includes a comment in support of critically examining race and the impact of systemic racism in the K-12 curriculum. Mr. Barker says this is proof that the principal supports critical race theory. The principal is present in the audience. What should the principal do? So I'm actually going to turn this over to our superintendent on the panel because this also involves the superintendent's role, particularly when we're involved in a school board meeting. Pat?
First, I turn on my mic. Thank you. So I would first say that I believe, from a superintendent's point of view, that the principal does not have to respond at the board meeting, and I believe should not. That's a very strong belief of mine. And remember, the last time at the last scenario, I said, we are going upon the premise that the principal informs the superintendent. So the superintendent, then it is on the board meeting is the realm of the superintendent and the board. Let the superintendent handle this since she was informed of the situation ahead of time. Speakers at board meetings need to be given a chance to speak at the public portion of the board meeting, open to any item, but not at a time when that's something that's not necessarily on the agenda. They have a right to be heard, but the board and the superintendent does not have to respond immediately. And that's the important thing, immediately, other than a respectful acknowledgement of their concerns. We don't have to answer their petition, this group's petition to cease and desist. The board's not obligated to follow what a petition states. That's why the board is an elected board. They're the ones who works with the superintendent to make those decisions. A mob of parents do not make those decisions. As Dave referenced earlier, opting out of the curriculum that is board approved and supports Public Law 2021, Chapter 32, it's not an option. The doctoral, in reference to the doctoral dissertation, I believe it proves that this teacher has extensive expertise in this area of culturally responsive teaching, but it does not mean that she is teaching what her doctoral dissertation was on. So the doctoral dissertation builds the expertise, but she's not necessarily teaching the specific content of CRT. The importance here is also of being courageous as a superintendent and as a board to support this work, because it is the right thing to do. The board has a code of ethics, and the board should be following that code of ethics, and which talks about meeting the individual needs of all children, regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing. So they have the responsibility of following that. And the other thing is the importance of providing training for the board so that they understand the difference between CRT and CRT. The final thing would be, I would piggyback off of what Robin said earlier about we should not, but this scenario should not be forgotten if the immediate problem was addressed and the roar of the crowd subsides. Instead, there needs to be the development of an ongoing plan, a communication plan, as Robin referenced earlier, that should be rolled out to address how are we communicating to the staff, to the board, to parents on the topic of culturally responsive teaching as mandated by Public Law 2021, Chapter 32. We have to take the opportunity in this case to then move forward and be proactive, not just say, okay, that fire was put out, but plan ahead and start having committee, a council, a group to how are we going to be addressing this in the future.
Great points. Thanks, Pat. I'm going to ask Karen as the high school principal to react to this one as well.
Absolutely. You know, I appreciate, Pat, the first thing you said, which is that the superintendent and the board have to understand their role, understand the purpose of that meeting, understand that it is not always necessary to give an answer when challenged with something at a board meeting. And in this situation, there are some additional issues at hand, because frankly, there are two staff members who've been raised publicly, and a public person has made a threat or called for some sort of disciplinary action to occur. So if the board did wind up addressing that, or the superintendent wound up addressing that in some way at a public meeting, that employee's rights had been violated, and that would be a really complex, sticky legal employment issue for those people, for those employees, and for the board and superintendent. So that's something that also needs to be managed in this situation. A scenario like that, though, when the principal is sitting in the crowd and something comes up pertinent to that building, you know, the temptation can be very easy for the board or the superintendent to turn and say, well, so-and-so's right here. Why don't you step to the mic? And you know, we're talking about opening lines of communication, and in some ways that could be looked at as a way of doing precisely that. But I think it is fraught with challenges of the ways that situation can go wrong. And so hopefully the board president, the superintendent, or some districts have their board attorney present at many or all of their board meetings, would intervene to say, you know, no, maybe it would be better if we got back to you about this. But, you know, we're always looking for solutions. And I've already talked about common language, common messaging, and you know, and communicating in very open ways with your community so that everybody's on the same page. But one of the things that we can do as far as an action step is we can follow up afterwards. We can have conversations with these people. We can invite the parents into a meeting with, you know, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction, the appropriate department or district supervisor, and we can talk about what the curriculum actually holds and how it is being implemented in the classroom. We can also invite a group of parents, a small working group of parents, to tackle this issue with the expectation that as we work on this together, we're all going to be communicating out about this, and that the parent voice is there as a part of a reflection of how our curriculum and how our teaching strategies and our overall pedagogy is going to be applied in our schools, so that that message even gets into the ranks of our parents, being on the front lines, arm in arm with us as we handle these particular challenges. And certainly we have student voice, and student voice is a very important factor in recognizing ways that we can acknowledge our students and make them be a part of what's happening in their own schools. And then the last thing I want to say is that we have to remember that, you know, when it comes to power, there is a power in knowing who you are as an educator. There's a power to knowing what you know as a school leader, as a teacher, as a supervisor. And with that knowledge, you are given the tools to build that bridge that we're talking about. You have that basis, that concrete basis on which to stand to bravely tackle the conversations, because you do know what you're doing. You do know what education is about, and you do know what your schools need for all of your students to be successful. So sometimes you just have to kind of swallow the fear, deal with it. And I'm not going to take it quite as far as saying fight or flight, but the fight doesn't have to be fists up and voices raised. The fight can be opening up that door to communication. Don't hunker down and don't shy away from it, because it's only through good conversation and good relationships that we're going to get our schools where we want them to be.
Thank you, Pat and Karen. I want to get us to the next scenario and invite Robin and Fidelia to respond, because then after this, I want to have some time where we can share the scenario takeaways, best practices, and some other key points. So take a look at scenario 3. Annually, New Jersey schools celebrate the Week of Respect during the first week of October. Educators plan activities in individual classes, as well as school-wide, to build camaraderie and to celebrate the differences of all students, with the goal of broadening understanding about others, to minimize the disrespect that can arise from lack of exposure to others' unique differences and backgrounds. A group of parents at the elementary level refuse to allow their children to participate, saying that culturally responsive teaching is really just a way of indoctrinating students into critical race theory. In addition, they worry that this type of instruction will make their children feel badly or uncomfortable, which is unacceptable to them as parents who should be the ones responsible for teaching ethics at home. What should the principal do? Fidelia, I'm going to ask you to respond first in your former life as an elementary school principal.
Thank you, Donna. When I look at this scenario, I began with annual. So this is not something new, but the key word is respect, the week of respect. I can't think of any adult parent who would not want their child to be respectful, okay? And the opposite of respect is disrespectful. I felt that the week of respect is an opportunity to have people or children celebrate the differences, because that's what our society consists of, differences. It's not about just simply talking about races. Critical race theory is about an academic concept. It's inclusive. It's inclusion in the form of contributions of what people have and what they've done in our society. And the Week of Respect is something that is celebrated throughout the state of New Jersey. I think if parents objected to it, as is stated here, then here's an opportunity to come together. Here's an opportunity to talk about the objective. Obviously, they're not sure what the objective of this celebration is about. When you bring them together and build those bridges, it's an opportunity to provide clarity and remove the fear. It's not about uncomfortableness. It's about being comfortable and sharing and growing. So I look at this as an opportunity to say to these parents, okay, let's come together and let's talk about the objective and what it means in terms of your child growing, not just today, but as they continue throughout their educational experience. So to me, it's a honest sit-down conversation to remove fear.
Thanks,
Robin?
Fidelia. Thank you. Robin? We still have Robin with us?
I think we might have lost her.
She might have dropped. Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to Pat to respond from a broader perspective.
Sure. I support it, reiterate what Fidelia said. The Week of Respect has been mandated by the DOE and is board approved, and therefore we know, I'm always speaking from the point that you can't, that children can't opt out because they're feeling bad. I would reiterate also what Fidelia said, focusing on what the objective of the Week of Respect is to build respect. And so having that conversation with the parents about what the real objective for that week is. School is the appropriate place for differences between groups to be addressed in age-appropriate manner by teachers who have received appropriate training. And so this goes to my real strong belief of training for our teachers. Ongoing training of teachers is critical to make sure that they are using the correct language and are comfortable with what they are sharing. And so my suggestion would be using age-appropriate children's books through, not only during the Week of Respect, but to dealing with any of these topics that we're dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, anything from chapter 32. Age-appropriate children's books really help in this way. It provides the correct language to use, since the majority of our teachers who are teaching our students still are white, and they haven't been trained in this area. And so it builds that comfort level. So what I wanted to share with you today is just an example that my librarian aide brought to my attention today of a children's book. It's called Unspeakable, and it's about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And it is written by Carol Boston Weatherford, but it's illustrated by one of my favorite illustrators, Floyd Cooper. I actually met Floyd Cooper years and years ago when I was a curriculum director. But the point is that if this was an area that was uncomfortable to talk about, the Tulsa Race Massacre, we know that's an uncomfortable topic, but it happened. It's true. It's something that in the textbooks that I was educated with, and most of us were, this wasn't even addressed. This whole idea. It's a great way to teach history and build respect for all races and for all people. So my urging of you is to build capacity within our teachers using the expertise of authors and using children's books to help guide the way it's going to be shared with students.
Donna, I'll offer one other thing. We have a great resource out there in our community of parents who are eager to be involved. We have home and school associations, PTA organizations. When it comes to something like the Week of Respect, there's no reason not to engage those other adults in the community as partners in planning activities. The more people who have ownership in what's happening in the school, the better off the school is in how those special events will be received.
Thanks to all of you. You really see some consistent themes around communication, transparency, bridge building, collaboration. I want to now ask Dave Nash to kind of walk us through some takeaways and talking points that will, I think, resonate very powerfully for some of the situations that you are experiencing in your own context. Dave?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Donna. So through these scenarios, and there is a fourth scenario that you have in your materials that really gets into students' First Amendment rights and their rights of expression and understanding the parameters of that. There's some important takeaways that we want to have. So it's important to support teachers when they're acting appropriately, as we saw in the scenario with Ms. Thomas in the AP history class. If you're making a factual assertion to your students, dealing with something like the existence of institutional racism, that is an appropriate role for a teacher to take in a classroom. And we want to recognize that this is something that has been specifically acknowledged in our state law as something that we need to address in the curriculum. So it's not a political stand, it's not an ideological stand, it is an appropriate factual assertion that we should be supporting teachers. We do want to stress the importance of board members understanding the code of ethics. It's very difficult at a board meeting where you might have inflamed passions, you might have a large group or a loud group of individuals at that board meeting. It's very difficult to resist the temptation to start discussing individual staff members. But it would be a clear violation of the code of ethics to start engaging in any sort of a negative discussion of individual staff members at a board meeting. And it's critical that board members understand that and understand the appropriate way to address those issues and not to do so in that public forum. It's appropriate for school leaders to engage in academic research, and including academic research on sensitive topics like the doctoral dissertation that we saw in one of these scenarios. And as we mentioned in reviewing that scenario, sometimes you're going to have information out there that goes into your personal views and your views of these complex academic issues, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, even if it's not directly what you'll be implementing in the curriculum. As we've said over and over again, there is no option to opt out of Chapter 32. It's important for us to engage with parents and get them to understand these issues and understand what we are doing. And that includes, at times, helping children to move out of their comfort zone, perhaps become a little bit uncomfortable in a safe, guided way as we talk about difficult issues, including issues related to race. We do know, and with more time, we would talk through this in more detail with scenario 4, that students have First Amendment rights to engage in political speech, even if others disagree with that speech, very different from the rights of a staff member working in a building during the school day. So where that staff member would not have that same right to wear political or politically charged attire. A student does, as long as we're not looking at something that's hate speech or lewd or vulgar or something that's causing substantial disruption. But I do want to stress that we want to avoid what's called the heckler's veto, where simply because somebody else might disagree with a certain point of view, we're going to not allow a student to have certain expression. So it's clear that we have to understand where that line is between appropriate expression and hate speech. It is important to have a comprehensive and ongoing professional learning for all stakeholders. If folks aren't equipped to deal with these sensitive topics appropriately, we're going to run into significant legal issues. It's critical for school administrators to review lesson plans, and we've said this a number of times. Well-intentioned teachers need to make sure that what they're doing actually is appropriate, actually is aligned with the curriculum. So it's important to take the time to review these lesson plans, engage with your staff, make sure they're using age-appropriate, properly vetted materials. We know that high-quality curriculum requires diverse content, requires us to ensure that students are thinking about points of view that we have not thought about in the past, that have not been part of our curriculum, and that might make some individuals uncomfortable, and it's important to do that. Transparency is a concept that we've been hearing over and over again as we talk through these scenarios, having that open line of communication at every level. This system will break down if students don't understand what we're doing, or parents or teachers, school district leaders, the board, or the community. And all this does take courage, right? It takes courage to let others know we have your back. We are going to be supportive of you. We know you're implementing difficult requirements. And of course, as part of having their back for all of the key stakeholders, we're getting the experts we need to make sure that we're doing this right. These are hard conversations to have. They're complex. We want to be proactive in bringing in the expertise we need. We also need to be proactive at working to have a more diverse staff. This is an issue that we see across the country. It is an issue in New Jersey. It takes significant effort to reach that goal of having greater diversity. And we've stressed throughout these scenarios the importance of common language and common messaging. That's part of the reason we gave some of those universal definitions that we did. We thought it might be useful to give a few basic talking points to you. We know that these are issues that come up as we're talking about these challenges. So for example, if you're confronted with an issue and you don't have all the information, something like this, I think, could be helpful. Thank you for bringing this issue to my attention. I want to make sure I have all the information necessary to respond. I'll talk to those involved. I'll gather more information and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Avoid the temptation to assume that whatever you're being told is actually accurate and respond with that assumption. If you're accused of promoting a political agenda or the ideology, diffuse that concern. Something like, please know that I'm committed to making sure we implement this curriculum without any political ideology. I'm happy to review specific questions you might have with our curriculum and how it's being implemented. So you kind of force the conversation to get much more specific. And when you do that, you can respond and you can allay those fears. When you're challenged about the very existence of institutional racism, something like this: our curriculum is consistent with state law. It includes well-vetted factual information that acknowledges the existence of institutional racism. And if you have questions about any specific aspect of the curriculum, I'm happy to review that and get back to you. And it puts you on much more manageable ground if you're discussing one particular aspect of the curriculum, one particular lesson plan, as opposed to getting into a debate over this larger issue of whether or not there is institutional racism. If parents indicate that it's their job to teach children about moral and ethical issues, this has been true for a very long time. New Jersey law recognizes certain universal principles. We've taught those as part of our curriculum for a very long time. And part of that is the universal principle of ensuring a safe, supportive environment for all children, celebrating diversity, promoting a deeper understanding of the root causes and the impact of both implicit bias and larger institutional discrimination issues. So these are universal principles that are specifically in our state-approved requirements. And when parents express the concern that children are being taught to be ashamed of or feel guilty about their race, allay that fear. Something like, we're committed to ensuring the social and emotional well-being of all students, and there's nothing in our curriculum intended to shame students or make them feel guilty. And again, get specific. If you think there's something specific in the curriculum that does this, let's talk about that. Tell me what your concern is, and I will get back to you on that issue. So you're engaging with the parent, you're not being dismissive, but you're also not accepting the faulty premise in the concern that the parent is bringing forward.
Thanks, David. We can give a quick pause, but I'm not seeing any big questions pop up. People are interested in asking a lot about getting the slide deck and the video recording. So here's a list of resources we put together that you may want to consider checking out. I'm not going to go through each one. When you get the PowerPoint, you should be able to access them. And as always, reach out to us for any support or questions that you have. FEA, both the professional learning side and the Legal One side, have tremendous resources to support your professional learning. We know that building a common understanding, a shared language, even within our districts and schools, is critical. And so we have a wide variety of resources to support this. In the summer, we launched an Equity in Action Leadership Academy for school and district-based teams that center around problems of practice. And so we actually added 2 more cohorts to this. If you go to the next slide, we've got online learning courses. That is a screenshot of our professional learning catalog. And we do a fair amount of coaching around DEI for leadership teams as well. And in the next slide, you'll see some of our upcoming workshops and the dates listed. These are identified. We selected these to target the needs of identified in today's session. We've also partnered with Dr. Robin Daniels, who's on our team today, to provide a cultural diversity audit So feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in exploring that resource. David, can you share with them some of the Legal One offerings to support their learning?
Absolutely. So we know that as we're talking about these issues, there are many potential legal ramifications to so many of these issues. So we have developed a number of self-paced online courses that can help you as you're addressing these topics, including our anti-bullying specialist certificate program, which is a comprehensive program that's really the equivalent of a full 3 days of in-person training. We have a number of shorter courses as well that deal with specific aspects of racism, equity, discrimination, the broad set of issues that we have walked through today. We also, of course, have a number of workshops and in-district programs that address all of these topics. And we have a Legal One podcast that we've started that airs new episodes on Mondays. And we have a number of episodes that we have aired that address issues of equity that are really critical for all of us to understand. And we have a number of new courses coming, and I highlighted 2 of those that address important aspects of equity as well.
David, before we close it out, I also want to share leadership roundtables have been a big part of the work that we've always done, but particularly the last 18 months. So I encourage everyone to keep their eyes open for a leadership roundtable that we will be sharing, and there'll be more than one to make it more convenient with times that Fidelia Sturdivant will be putting together to bring you together to collaborate on some of these issues in a more narrow, targeted way that gives you an opportunity to collaborate.
So as we wrap up today's session, of course, we want to thank all of you for the incredible work that you're doing every day on so many different fronts. This is just one of a number of monumental issues that we know that you are putting into a place and dealing with every single day. You're fighting so hard for our children, fighting so hard to support what we need to be doing in our schools. We wanted to give you the resources to help you in that effort. We wanted to help you think through the foreseeable challenges that could arise. And we want you to have a comfort level. When you're doing the right thing, when you're addressing these complex, important issues, know that there is a network out here to support you. We at NJPSA and FEA want to be there for you every step of the way. If you have any issues where you need additional support, please reach out to us. And we did include here both my email address and, of course, Donna McInerney's email address as well. Any way that we can support you, we want to be here for you as you do this incredibly important work.
Dave, before you leave, they were asking questions about when the session for LGBTQ and ableism is going to be.
So we are planning that for sometime in October. We have not finalized the date yet, but we are planning that. It'll just be another couple of weeks, and we will be offering that session very shortly. Karen, any final comments before we wrap up?
I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I also want to thank our panelists, Robin Daniels, Pat Haney, David Nash, Donna McInerney, and Fidelia Sturdivant. You know, NJPSA and FEA work really hard to try to provide the information that arrives at the perfect moment, hopefully, to help you navigate what you're going through in schools. I encourage you to reach out to us if you have suggestions, ideas, needs, clue us in, and we will do what we can to support you. And more importantly, just hang in there, fight the good fight, fight it with open arms, bring people into the fold, and bring your communities back to what we know they are capable of being. Schools have been the glue through this past pandemic and frankly through all of society, and our communities know it, and we are here to support you and partner with you every step of the way. So I wish you all happiness, health, and we're only a phone call away if we can do anything to help you at all. Have a great day.